говорить по-английски, но...
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll speak English. And those of you who require interpretation, please get yourself a headset.
Director, also a researcher, but it's nicer to be a library director when you talk about a book, so that would be the main title today. And I'm happy to present you Mazda Adli, who didn't just wrote the book. He wrote the book 4 years ago, right? 2 years ago. But the book was just published by Moskovский Urbanistic Forum, and so today we would talk about the book, and then you would have a chance to ask the questions to the author. I must say that there isn't a book title, which would describe my day better than the stress of the city today. All the traffic jams and afraid of being late for the session and all this. And as you've mentioned in a book, it should be nice to have stress fighting classes at school. I would need them, and yeah, I feel like that would be a perfect story. So the Russian language readers would soon see your book and will have a chance to have their own opinion. But could you tell us a bit about how the book was already accepted by the audience? What were the strangest, the worst, or the nicest reactions you had? And how did it go, basically?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very, very honored to see this book in Russian, and it's a new experience to see my name written in Russian in Cyrillic letters, and so that's something that makes me very happy. And well, what was the starting point of this endeavor of this book? I'm a psychiatrist. I treat patients in Berlin, Germany's largest city, and I'm a stress researcher. And as a psychiatrist, I noticed the increasing amount of epidemiological data showing that people living in cities have a higher risk of suffering from stress-related mental diseases, like depression or anxiety. And it's even best shown for schizophrenia that there is even a dose-response relationship. For the size of the city you live in, the larger the city, the higher your risk for schizophrenia. And for the amount of time someone has grown up in a city. A double dose-response relationship, size and time. And this points very much towards causation in science. So, and it's we even know that when during the first 15 years of life, a child moves from a rural environment to the city, the risk for schizophrenia goes up, and if it moves back to a village, it goes down again. So there is really a dose-response relationship, and I was very much then interested to better understand why that is, because we all know that healthcare in cities is much better. It's much easier to find a psychiatrist or even a psychotherapist. So why is it that people suffer much more frequent from these diseases? And this is why I thought I have to get a better understanding, and I found that there is barely any research about this interaction between mental health, emotions, behavior, and urban environments. And so I started this a project. It's also connected with a research project that we're doing in Berlin. We have founded a new academic science called neurourbanism, and it's basically the methodological joint venture between neuroscience and urban research.
So I would get back to the reception of the book a bit later, but can you tell me, within writing the book and now still having your practice as the main job, as far as I understand, did the book influence how you treat your patients in any way? Now knowing more about the cities, does it affect how you work?
I would say yes, it does. I myself am much more sensible towards stressors of the environment, and that are influential for our mental well-being. It's basically, urban living comes with stress. That's normal. There's no life without stress whatsoever, and in city living comes with increased stress. But it's not all kinds of stresses that negatively affect our health. It's social stress that is the toxic agent for our mental health. Social stress that becomes chronic and uncontrollable. That's where the problem starts. And in my daily clinical practice, I think I'm much more sensitive towards social stress in the life of people. I want to better explain what I mean by social stress. It's the stress that arises when a lot of people share a limited space.
Уважаемые гости Московского урбанистического форума 2019. В 15:30 в зале Urban Health состоится пленарное заседание по итогам Конгресса Urban Health с участием руководителя Роскомнадзора Анны Поповой.
That counts as stress, right?
Yeah, it's a distractor, but it's a good example. That's acute stress. I mean, because it's temporarily limited, now the voice is gone and I can resume. But if there's one distractor after the next, and if every 3 or 5 seconds the voice comes back, then the stress may become not only annoying but also harmful. So it's the unpredictable and uncontrollable social stress. What do I mean by social stress? It's social density on the one hand, like social density, which means overcrowding, and social isolation on the other hand, as a result from the experience of social exclusion, or for example also loneliness. If both come at the same time, density and isolation, if an individual is exposed to both stressors at the same time, then that might harm our mental health.
Thank you. Following what you started, talking about the loneliness and stress and so on, I guess you know that now ministries of loneliness appear, and it becomes a part of official healthcare to prescribe walking in the park or reading a book in some of the countries, which also seems to be one of the ways to fight stress within the city limits. Would you say that you see that within how cities are changing, or how healthcare is changing, or how general government is changing? Do you see that there is something happening, that there is a stress prevention or stress fighting kind of things happening on a scale which makes you optimistic in this way?
Well, I would wish that there was much more than there is right now. We're still not really being heard by city authorities, for example, and we're only at the beginning. Yes, there is some awareness. There is especially awareness about the fact that city living and physical health are related in a way, but the mental health issue is still much more on the blind spot. And we have right now published a Charta of Neurourbanism, which is basically a summary of recommendations out of the collaboration between neuroscience, psychiatry, psychology, architecture, and urban design, and to provide advice, recommendations to urban designers and also to city authorities.
You have already mentioned the influence the city has on kids growing up, and there's a lot of that in your book on different stages and different kind of influences. And also at the very beginning you say that you would talk about Berlin a lot, mentioning that it's a very tense big city. Of course, we here think we are the tense big city with more traffic and more scary. But anyway, would you say that you also mentioned an experiment in Mannheim, which, as far as I understand, kind of showed exactly what you were saying, that it's actually bad for your health to grow up in a big city, as far as I could understand it in easy terms?
Yeah. Well, it's not necessary. It's not bad for our health. That's important to really make clear. City living doesn't harm our health per se. City living changes the way our brain processes stress. It changes the way our brain deals with stress. And if we carry other risk factors, for example, for schizophrenia, a genetic risk factor, it may in some result in a disease. You mentioned the study from our colleagues in Mannheim. This very nicely showed how stress, how the brain of the urban dweller copes differently, deals differently with stress. They did functional magnetic resonance imaging in healthy volunteers who either resided in a big city, in a small city, or in a rural village. And the volunteers underwent a social stress task while lying in the scanner, which means solving hard arithmetic mathematical problems under time pressure with constant negative feedback by the experimenters. And what this...
Let me mention that negative feedback, as far as I can understand from the description, means that they were shouted at and they were said that they cannot do things right and so on. So it was quite a stressful
they weren't exactly
feedback.
Shouted at, but they were, permanently commented, like, you're really bad in maths, and can you please be a little bit quicker, and these experiments cost a lot, and if you're performing that bad, we cannot use your results, etc. So a really a not very nice situation, but that's a social stress paradigm in experimental psychology. And what they found was that the amygdala, that's the part of the brain which processes environmental threat and social stress, that the amygdala was had an increased activity with an increasing size of the city someone lived in. They were all healthy, but the brain reacted differently and reflected the city size where people came from. And this is why we know that the brain of the urban dweller is maybe more responsive to stress. It's not necessarily a negative thing. It also can be something like a training effect.
But would you say, from all the research you do and your colleagues do, that there is a right strategy for a person? Like, you grow up in a village, then you move to a bit bigger city. Is there something you would say is the right way of changing the sizes of the cities?
Well, the solution is definitely not to avoid the city, because at the same time the city has a lot of wonderful advantages. If you grow up in a city, you have much easier access to education and to all kinds of support. And Richard Sennett, who we were expecting this afternoon, once said that children that grow up in a city have a much better chance of becoming good and mature democratic personalities, because they're used to the complexity of reality and to the diversity in society from very early ages on. So city living has a lot of good advantages, and we all live in cities, and in large cities, and we like it. And there's also better healthcare. There is the cultural richness of our cities, which attract people to move there. So the solution is not to avoid the city; it's to shape cities in a way that is good for our brains, in a way that is good for our minds, and that is what this book is about.
One of the topics of your book is a collective trauma of the city, how big events could influence the whole city and its citizens. So I would finish the question, but then please explain what I mean. And then one of the things that people often say about Moscow, we have quite a tense history of traumatic events, meaning terror acts, etc., in post-Soviet era. And quite often you can hear that Muscovites forget it too quickly, that we do not remember it as a city well enough. Would you say that remembrance is also, forgetting is also a way of coping with trauma, or how would you describe that? But then first, a couple of words about collective trauma. And
definitely in individual psychology, forgetting is one of the coping strategies of dealing with trauma. But it's not always a good solution to forget, because we also know that then sometimes, very frequently, other symptoms develop that reflect the trauma. And speaking for a city that is traumatized, in my experience, cities that undergo a difficult time, for example, a war, and have to be rebuilt and reinvented afterwards, identify much more with their own values. Let me explain it in another and easier way. Every city has its own inherent logic, a system of values and unwritten rules. I mentioned it in another discussion yesterday. My city, Berlin, has the value of creativity. It's very, very important, and it's much more important than economic stability. Our former mayor, Klaus Wowereit, put it in the words, Berlin is poor but sexy. And that's actually how people feel, and many people agree to that. And so, and a city that undergoes hard and difficult times and traumatizing times frequently identifies much stronger with these values at the end, than without such a trauma. So that's something that we very frequently find. The inherent logic of a city, the unwritten rules of the city, they normally survive.
One of the things you mentioned is that the post-trauma feeling of the city may be more scared or more tense. You were mentioning the New York events with kidnapping, and then of course the 9/11. And so how would you see, what's the what's the right way for city of surviving big changes, and how citizens, how people in the city should react to big events in it, in a way. So is there a way to cope with stress together? Should it be together? Should it be somehow reflected, like a mutual experience? I don't know.
Okay, these are two questions. Let me clarify the New York example. You mentioned the much higher security level which we can experience on the streets when we visit New York after 9/11. You know, the security and securing things has always been among the unwritten rules of New York, I would say. It has only become much more visible and much stronger after 9/11 than it was before. So this is nothing really new. Okay. It's only something that is more visible and stronger, but it existed before, shaping a city in a very in a secure way. Your question was, well, how can we
should there be
cope?
some mutual, like, city level way of dealing with stress?
Yes. If it's true that social stress plays a key element and is harmful for our health, it's important to reduce the social stress that we all are exposed to, the chronic social stress. That means reducing the experience of uncontrollable density, and also minimizing the risk for social isolation, especially in people who are at higher risk of experiencing social isolation, such as older people, because their mobility gets worse when they get older, for example, or as I mentioned before, people with a migration background. What we need is an antidote to social stress, and that is, for example, public space. Public space where people meet, where social cohesion develops, where people interact, protects from being socially isolated. So we need all these. We need those places, the free zones, in our urban environments where we just can spend our times and meet other people. It of course also includes green space, such as this wonderful park that is around us here, because that's also of course a place that brings people together. And we have just now completed a study in Berlin with my research group 2 weeks ago, which shows that urban green space near the area where you live protects your brain against social stress. We find that with the percentage of green space, 1,500 meter radius around the place of residence is directly correlated with activity in those brain areas that protect us from stress. The more green space, the more activity in those protecting areas, without people even noticing. So we only examined people that reported experiencing the same level of daily stress. They all, on a subjective level, experience the same level of stress. But with the more green space they had around them, the more resilient were their brains. And that's why all the public spaces, all the parks, and every tree in the city has a public health impact.
In almost each chapter of your book, and even in each part of each chapter of your book, the reader can find the different influences and different connections. Something like feeling yourself low on the social scale in the city makes you more unhappy, and it influences your brain. You mentioned the migration, you mentioned the loneliness and so on. So it feels like within the book there are so many types of these influences. So would you say that there is any kind of short way of making a system of the influences? Would you say that it's easy to mention? Would it be these groups you already mentioned, or a bit more diverse group of people that have to be protected in a way within the city, that have to be supported because we know that their brain is actually affected by the way they live? Because it sounds like you know these connections to how people live in the city, to how they will behave and how they will feel because their brain is affected. So it feels like there's something we have to prescribe them right away, in a way, if we know that they are influenced. So would you say that, can you mention the groups that you feel that the reader of your book should remember as something that has to be taken care of and so on?
Well, it's basically, you're asking who are the high-risk people, right?
How you make a system of that, how do you want people to remember the groups, and how do you think we should deal with them also, if you know? Yeah.
Well, it's very much about feeling isolated. The city living comes with more anonymity. That's what we know, and that's what many of us find attractive. Being in an anonymous large city, not being observed all the time, escaping social control. That's attractive to many of us, especially young people who come into the cities. But the flip side of it is that the risk of isolation and loneliness is higher. So everything that we can do to prevent people from being isolated, or preventing ourselves from feeling isolated or lonely in the city, is a good idea. This is why I would very simply say, time spent in front of your doorsteps, is time which protects you from social stress. So we need a stimulating environment that invites us to step out of our rooms, out of our doors, out of our houses, so step out, participate with the city, try to make yourself, try to find a sense of belonging to your environment, belonging to your city. Try to explore your neighborhood. Do you know how your neighbors? Do you know all your neighbors by name, for example?
Oh no, no.
So that's a good idea to do. You can start by looking at the names on the doorbells. And do you know the people who work in the shops around the place where you live? Familiarize yourself with your environment and increase your sense of belonging. That's also something that protects you from social stress in urban environments.
In your answer now and before, you mostly, and it's an important part of the book, I understand that, it's the main part of the book, you mentioned the social stress and the social connectivity, etc. But you also talk a lot about the physical space of the city, the traffic, the sound, the smell, and so on. So could you tell us a bit more about that? So what would you see as the main urban issues in the physical sense, in the sense of space?
Well, there are, of course, all kinds of physical stressors, like noise, and it's much told about noise and physical health. We know that chronic noise exposure increases our blood pressure, etc. But not much is known about the exact influence on mental health. And again, we can say when noise turns into social stress, it becomes toxic for our psychic well-being. No, and that's the case when noise just enters our area of privacy. When I'm sitting in my apartment and a very loud car whoosh, rushes through the street, that's something that we usually dislike, and it's because it's territorial stress. It's something that enters our own personal territory, and by evolution and in our genes, there is we have the program that automatically puts us into a state of alarm, and that's when noise becomes social stress. And when that noise becomes uncontrollable, if you cannot turn it off, then it influences our mental health, and it decreases our concentration abilities. For example, we know that children who are exposed to chronic traffic noise have harder times at school and harder times to concentrate than other children, and that the risk of experiencing depression is higher.
You've already mentioned the public spaces as one of the most important things to deal with stress, with the connection to other people and to the city itself. You also, within your book, you also mentioned cultural infrastructure quite a few times as a part of the good things that happen to you in a big city. So could you tell a bit more about the urban infrastructure that you find important in general, and like what are the good public spaces in terms of stress fighting that you've mentioned?
It's every place that is good, that helps us to come together. And you just mentioned the cultural places like theaters, like galleries, cinemas, little stages, concert halls, etc. All these cultural places are public space that counteract social isolation. That's why I say that cultural institutions also have a public health impact. And one of the opera directors in Berlin, who is my friend Barry Kosky, when I explained this to him, said, "Oh yes, that's true. That's why the health insurance should pay part of the opera fees and the tickets." And in a way, that's true. The city's culture, including the cultural heritage of a city, is something that protects us from social stress, and at the same time connects us with the city's values and unwritten roles and the inherent logic, and helps us to gain a sense of belonging.
Thank you. Are there questions in the audience? We will be getting to the end, so it's important that you have time for it. Yeah. Yeah. I think you need you would need the headphone. Mazda? Oh. You would, yeah. It's in Russian. The question is in Russian, yeah.
Okay. May I ask in English?
Oh, you can ask in English, so perfect, yeah.
So you told us about that Berlin is famous for its creativity, right? So how do you find it?
Well, if it's famous or not, I can't judge, but it's very important. It's one of the high values of Berlin, and so it's important. It's a high value to find art spaces or ateliers with low rentals. If you say in Berlin, I'm an artist, it's even better than to say I'm a medical doctor or a teacher or so. So it's just very, very high in value.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Any more? Okay, if someone has a question, shout, and I would ask the finalizing one. So, first of all, one of the things, if I understood it right, in the book, that you mentioned that understanding the stress and how it affects you may help you to fight it. And so, but then reading your book is also kind of a stress because you realize how many things you cannot avoid and they actually influence you. That's part of the bargain in reading your book. You know more, but you also scared more. So can you say, if on a human level, what should a person know and think about? You know, how should we deal with the knowledge of stress? What's the right amount, basically? What we should remember as a human beings being in a big city about the stress?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that stress per se is not the problem. Our biology and our brains is absolutely well designed to cope with stress. And it's true, the more you know about the possible stressors, the better the coping strategies. So stress per se is not harmful. Stress in the course of evolution has helped us to react more flexibly and to adapt to our environments. So we're fine with stress, but it's the chronic stressors, the unavoidable stressors, the unescapable stressors that might be harmful, and even those are not avoidable by 100%. So what we can do is to strengthen our resources and to strengthen our resilience, and we do that. We strengthen and empower ourselves if we gain better access to the urban advantage, to the benefits of the city, to the education, to the cultural richness, to the city's wonderful complexity and diversity. And that's important, and therefore it's also important for city makers, for city builders, for city administrators to understand that it's important to provide low access to the advantages, and that it begins with enough parks and green space all around the city, but it doesn't end with affordable tickets to the theater, as I just explained. It's part of the advantage of the city.
And how many minutes do we have? How many minutes do we have left? Okay. One of the questions I've been waiting to ask from the very beginning, but I think it's now time. If you love Berlin, if you would become a mayor of Berlin, what would be the first rule you would do? Stress-related rule to make your favorite city better.
What would the first thing be?
Rule. The rule you
rule.
would, yeah,
Okay.
the new rule for the city. What would you imagine? You may not be a mayor, be a wizard. It's okay. I mean, you can be anyone, but just make a new rule for Berlin, which you think would make it better stress-wise.
I don't know if that would bring me many friends, but the first rule would be, for every square meter that is where a new building is being built and erected, we need a new square meter of public space. So because that's really my concern, that the public space in our cities are getting they're disappearing, because the ground and the square meters everywhere are getting more and more expensive. So so the public space is disappearing, but that's also our public health guarantee, the public space, as I explained. So for every square meter that is being covered by a building, we need a new square meter that provides open and free space.
I actually like it a lot. if it includes libraries, then it's perfect.
Okay, so I have you at least as a friend. then.
And also, could you tell? So you were mentioning the new discipline that is appearing from the research like yours, which is neurourbanism. Can you say a bit how you see this discipline evolving? How would you see it developing? What do you expect from the subjects like this one in the future?
Well, we're also at the beginning. We're, to my knowledge, the first group that works in this interdisciplinary way and connects architects and urban designers with neuroscientists. My wish is that many others will follow in other parts of the world, here in Moscow as well as in New York or in Singapore, that investigate and study the impact of the urban environments in the different parts of the world on the people's mental health.
So do you see it as a part of urban planning in the future? Like this is something that has to be
Absolutely.
included in the...
Absolutely, and if I look on our results and on our results from our research, there's so much to know for urban designers. There's so much to understand for city authorities that may be helpful to shape cities in a way that they are still livable tomorrow and attractive for us tomorrow. And this is something that I very much wish, and I try to contribute to that by this book.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I have a question. You said that the more time the person spends outside the home, the less this person is exposed to social stress. So, comparing to Tokyo, where people have less living space, where they live in a really small flats or whatever, they spend more time outside. For example, that is Tokyo example. Do you think that in the future we will get rid of the term home, so we will spend as minimum time at home as possible? How do you see the future of our homes? Will they become smaller? Or
Our homes might become smaller as space becomes more limited. Absolutely, but still, every person needs a home and needs his or her own protective area. That's something which is really written down in our genes. We need our own private territory. The size doesn't really matter, but the quality of how it protects myself against the outside world is extremely important. So in order to, we might live in a little room, but in order to not experience uncontrollable density, it's important that I have a good quality door to shut behind me that allows me to restore and to recover. So it's more about the quality of the limits and than the square meters and the space itself.
Yeah, one last question and we finish. Yeah.
Nikolai.
My name is Nikolai and I come from the city of Kaliningrad. I frequently travel to Berlin. My name is Nikolai and I'm from the city of Kaliningrad. Me and my family frequently travel to Berlin. Berlin is a wonderful city. So my question is this: are you aware of other cities in the world which are free from stress? And what part of Berlin is most free from stress?
Thank you for this question. Is there any city free from stress? No city. And I've had the big chance of living in different large cities of this world, in Berlin as well as in Paris, in Vienna, in Tehran, in San Francisco, etc. All of these cities have come with stress. City living is stressful, but the way they cope with stress is very different. And so a city free of stress doesn't exist, wouldn't probably be very attractive, but it's the coping styles that differ, and which have much to do with the just mentioned inherent system of their logic, with their mentality, with their values, etc.
Thank you very much. I do genuinely recommend to read the book. It really brings a very special connection between what you can easily relate and know about yourself. You recognize the stresses described there. It's not easy if you live in Moscow for sure, but in other cities too, as we just discussed. But it also explains you and gives you the measures of the meanings of seeing the bigger picture of the city. And I think it's really a great book for Urban Forum, and I'm happy they translated it. So congratulations to Urban Forum too. Thank you, Mazda. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.